We can just start maybe with welcoming everyone that it's able to attend, and more so welcome to our speaker, Diana Schutz, who is now connecting with us from Portland, Oregon. This is a lecture that the Art and Literature magazine has organized as a series for this semester, and we are planning in continuing into the next. The aim of the lecture is that to bring together with the students and faculty and the community at large, people that are professional in their own trade, so that we can learn from real writer, editor, publisher, graphic designer, the aspect of a job that maybe we are starting to embrace, but that we may not know deeply. And this is an opportunity for this individual to share with us their experience, give us some tips, and to get to know them as a person. So there's not just a name on a publication, but it becomes an individual with his history, his career. Now, before I go into introducing the guest, I want to make sure this is an opportunity for me to advertise our magazine, who is now actually requesting submission for the next issue. So this is our latest issue of the Art and Literature magazine. Everyone, students and faculty at Monco, is invited to submit, and information can be found on Connect under the page of the club. So with that cover, I'm going to introduce Diana. And Diana is an incredible resume, let's say. She's an award-winning editor who has been working in comics for over 40 years. She was a senior executive editor at Dark House Comics, where she was on staff from 1990 to 2015. She was Frank Miller's editor for Sin City and 300. Matt Wagner's editor for Grendel, Stan Sakai's editor for Usagi Yojimbo, I hope I'm not, Paul Chadwick's editor on Concrete, and Larry Mander's editor on Beanworld. She applied her knowledge to Romance languages to edit international material in translations such as Black Sad and the Manara Library. She has worked with authors Michael Chabon, Neil Gaiman, Harvey Picard, and Arlan Ellison, among others. She was fortunate to have been Will Eisner's Dark Horse editor until his death in 2005. She is also an adjunct instructor of comic studies at Portland State University, a published author of both comics and prose, and the first woman to be introduced into the Canadian Comic Book Creator Hall of Fame. Semi-retired, she now works as a literary translator of European comics, including work by Mebius, Manara, Munoz, and Sampaio, and more. So with this, welcome, Diana, and I hope I went through, but your life and your experience and your name is so big, it's hard to condense.
Well, thank you, but it's very small. And while he's here, let's also mention that for a time I was Shannon Wheeler's editor on Too Much Coffee Man, since Shannon has joined us today.
Thank you for that addition. Thanks. So we have a plan for today, a question and answer session. And we will go around with some of the questions we have collected by the people who submitted to the magazine. And we will have plenty of time at the end also for a question that may come up today during the lecture. Now, just so that people that are not familiar with you, or maybe they're not familiar with what being an editor of comics and ties, could you please give us an overview of like your freelance position, translating what you're doing now, translating this international comics, and what was the work at Dark House Comics?
Well, I didn't really start translating until after I had left Dark Horse. And if you have that first slide, you can see a variety of the books that I have already translated, either alone, either alone or with my partner, Brandon Kander. So these are just some of the books. Right now, I'm working on the Mobius library for Dark Horse, and that you'll see the next slide. Yeah, this is the current book that I'm translating. Yeah, not not nearly enough words there. So this is a book called Le Major, the Major, and it refers to Major Grubert, who is a popular character from Mobius's Airtight Garage. And then the next thing that Brandon and I are working on is a book called Les Indes Fourbes. It's painted by Juanjo Guarnido, who is the co-creator and artist on Black Sand. And you can see the gorgeous, subtle atmospheric work that he's capable of producing there. There's a reason that Black Sand has sold fantastically. At Dark Horse is like printing money to reprint Black Sand. So this is his new work, and Brandon and I are translating it. Somebody had something to say in there, and so we work for a variety, actually, of different publishers, not just Dark Horse, but I am semi-retired, so I only really take on projects that interest me. I'm not doing this for a living. Translation, despite the fact that translation involves being able to write creatively, because it's really not a one-to-one correspondence between languages. You really have to, knowing the meaning doesn't mean it doesn't mean you have the words necessarily to express that meaning. There are any ways of expressing meaning. And so in order to express another author's meaning in your own native language, you need to be able to write. There are no two ways about it. You also obviously need to be able to understand a second language and understand the culture that produced that language. And despite all these sort of heavy duty qualifications, translators are paid very, very poorly, less than most letterers per page. So I'm lucky that I've taken this on in my 60s because the kids who are doing this in their 20s really have a tough row to hoe with it. They're not paid well, and they have to zoom through the work in order to make a living. So the way it is in the industry, I'm afraid. So, but I love it. For me, it's, it allows me to be creative within constraints. So it's perfect for me.
So I guess I'll ask my question now. Okay. On the note of your career as an editor, when did you decide to become an editor, and did you always want to be an editor?
I've been thinking about this, Tom, and no, I did not always want to be an editor. I went to school I got my bachelor's degree in the early to mid 70s. And, like any teenager, angsty teenager of that era, I was going to be a poet. So I was studying creative writing, and philosophy and in search of truth and meaning. But, you know, it occurred to me, it, poetry actually is very much like comics, and that comics work with fragments. If you can put up the next slide, it's from Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics. And you see that because comics consist of static images, panels, they're sort of like digital moments almost that we connect into an analog reality. And I think poetry works in kind of a similar fashion in that it also deals with fragments of meaning that we have to connect to something greater. But when did I decide I wanted to be an editor? I think I just sort of fell into it, frankly. I wasn't much of a poet. I wasn't much of a teenage poet, and then I wasn't much of a philosopher either. But man, when I left school and went to work at the comic book store, I found my tribe.
Mhm.
So it was, you know, when I fell in love with comics for the second time as an adult, it was then that I sort of realized I really wanted to work in publishing, and I had the skills to be an editor. I had all the organizational skills that philosophy and thinking skills that philosophy had given me, and I'd had the writing skills from my education as well.
Yeah. I also like that you mentioned how you fell in love with comics a second time, meaning you loved comics as a child. And it's so interesting how some of the things we love as a child is actually a rehearsal for our adult lives, especially for teachers or scholars. And we've been studying all our lives in a way. So, yeah.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, yeah, if we're not learning at every moment, what the hell are we doing anyways, right? So, yeah.
It's true. Okay. I think I'm on next. Can you hear me? There we go. Diana, I'm going to ask the next question. Since you already just mentioned about your working at the comic book store, the question kind of relates to that. How did working there and editing a fanzine prepare you for being job as an editor? Okay, your job as an editor. And in other words, how did both direct and lateral job experiences kind of help you build your resume as to where you are today?
Diane, I think that really, working retail, first of all, you learn the business of comics. You're right down there on the front lines, selling to the people who ultimately pay your paycheck because they're the ones purchasing the reads. And working in publishing, specifically working as an editor, it's really important to know the business. You have to know what projects are going to sell well enough, both for the creator and the publisher, to pay everyone a fair living. So learning the business was one aspect. If we can move ahead a couple of slides, I think, to the telegraph wire. That's a few more down. This one. Yeah, 7. That's it. While I was at Comics and Comics in Berkeley, it was a popular era. This was 1981. And it was sort of a popular era for comic book stores to publish a newsletter. Usually it was just a little Xerox thing. that's how we started the Telegraph Wire. It was just a little Xerox newsletter. But Comics and Comics was a 7-store chain in Northern California. So the newsletter that we started was distributed through all 7 stores. And I still run into people today who read that thing. It eventually morphed. I talked my bosses into letting me do it as an honest to God magazine or fanzine. And I modeled it loosely on the Comics Journal. So I was interviewing people, writing reviews. I was getting other people to work for the magazine, like you, Francesca, with your Art and Lit mag, where you're going out and soliciting other contributors to the magazine. You do a lot yourself, but then you try to get other people to fill in some of the pages so that you're not doing everything yourself. So this was, I mean, this was actually really important to me. It taught me a lot about editing. There were no computers in those days, so everything was hand typed. I hand typed everything. I pasted up. I learned how to do paste up mechanicals. My friend Tom Orzechowski, who was then lettering X-Men, designed the logo and taught me about paste up and helped me design this little magazine. And we published it every 2 months. We gave it out for free at all of the 7 stores. And of course, I met all these creators in the process to interview them. The middle slide is Scott McCloud, who at the time was doing a comic called Zot, and who went on to write and draw the seminal Understanding Comics, which sort of kicked off the entire comic studies movement in academia. This was Scott's very first interview ever for my little fanzine. And ditto the Hernandez brothers, the Love and Rockets guys, did their first interview with me. Arthur Adams and Mike Mignola, who were customers of mine at the Berkeley Comics and Comics, did the cover on my right. Matt Wagner, who I would eventually start working with at Kamiko, and who would in fact become my brother-in-law. Also, you know, I interviewed him for that issue of the Telegraph Wire. He did a color cover. So, I mean, look, when you're trying to break into any job, publishing or whatever, you need to get to know the people who are going to hire you. Networking is the same in comics as it is anywhere else. And working on this little magazine was a great opportunity for me to meet a wide variety of people, not just the creators, but I had to, this little magazine, in order for my bosses to allow me to work on it, I had to make it monetarily self-sufficient, which meant I had to get ads. I had to solicit ads. So I would call up people at Marvel Comics and DC Comics and say, will you pay to take out a little ad in my little fanzine for comics? And yes, they would. And so I got to know sort of just a wide variety of people in the comics industry by doing this. And that eventually led to a job offer in publishing.
It's awesome.
Yeah. So it's, you know, when people ask how to break into the industry, certainly one of the ways is by going to work at a comic shop. You learn a lot.
Do you think that today a comic shop serve the same function, or there may be other event that's substitute for a show?
Well, today, of course, people have the ability to post their work online, which is not something that we could do back then. It didn't exist, you know.
Yeah.
So I would say there are probably other avenues for people now. But this is still a legitimate way of breaking in. Yeah.
So,
Awesome. Thank you.
given the path that you've taken, is there, as an editor, which are your proudest moment in your career? What would you highlight?
You know, I sent you many photos of
Yeah,
me winning awards.
please
With-
tell us more. Than,
So, all right. So this is Michael Chabon, Pulitzer-winning author, and we published The Amazing Adventures of the Escapist, which was based on his Pulitzer-winning novel, and was an anthology comic. We won the Eisner that year for Best Anthology. Skip to the next photo, and you will see me with Juanjo Guarnido, the artist of Black Sad, winning for Best International. And the next photo, which is one of my favorites, because that's Edward James Olmos, thank you very much, who presented me with an Eisner in 2015, again for Best International Book, which was Black Sad. You know, handsome actor kisses you, gives you an Eisner. It's not a bad day. And then working with so many people who really became my friends. You know, people that whose work I had admired beforehand when I was younger, before I ever dreamed I would get into publishing. And one of those people was Harlan Ellison. So, you know, and then out of the blue, suddenly I was in a position to work with Harlan, and I did. And that professional and personal relationship continued right up until his death, you know. So these are very proud moments for me. The next photo, of course, is Will Eisner, who is considered the godfather of the comics industry. I mean, he was around at the very beginning. He was the first person to sort of conceive it as an art form. He was the first person to publish a textbook on comics, comics and sequential art. The Eisner Awards are named after him. Anyway, I was very lucky in the last 5 years of his life to become his dark horse editor, and he became very much like a surrogate father to me. So, so yeah, these are important moments in my career to me. I think the next slide, working with Matt Wagner, I've worked with Matt longer than anyone else. I became his editor in 1985 or 1986, I think. Matt is the creator of Mage and Grendel. This is from the most recent Mage, colored by Matt's son, who is my nephew, because a few years into my relationship with Matt, I introduced him to my younger sister, and it was love at first sight. I was right in Philadelphia, by the way, close to where you guys are. And so I've worked with Matt my entire career, and then in this last Mage series, which I edited a couple years ago, again, my nephew did the coloring. So it was a complete family affair. And so much so, in fact, that you'll see in the middle panel, that's my niece, Amanda. And in the upper panel at right is my brother-in-law, Matt, who wrote and drew the comic. And the witch perched over the what do you call that? I'm having a senior moment.
Globe, the globe, the sphere.
Yes, anyway, the witch is me. So so it really, you know, the whole family is kind of in this book, and the whole family participated in the creation of the book. So those are, that was the last thing that I edited, actually. So.
And incidentally, if I can add, it's your nephew that provided us that drawing of you.
Yes.
It was used for the poster by Diane.
Yes. Yeah.
Awesome.
My nephew Brennan. Yeah, it's, you know, he worked at his father's side his whole life. When he was 7 or 8 years old, he started drawing comics just like Daddy, you know. So, yeah. And I think the next slide is, working with Neil Gaiman, of course, another highlight in my career. But we can go through these pretty quickly because I know I gave you a lot of slides for this. The next one is working with Barry Windsor Smith. Again, I mean, these were Neil. I had known before he started working on Sandman, but Barry, I had been a huge fan of Barry's back in the 70s. So when I was given the opportunity to work with him in the 90s, that, you know, it's like, oh, fangirl dream come true here. But I think that your question probably has, I mean, for me, it's about my working relationships, the friendships that I've developed in the course of those working relationships, the people who mean the world to me. But I think where your question really wanted to go was about the project and are there projects, are there books that I am most proud of? And, you know, it's impossible to kind of name your favorite. Everything is your favorite while you're working on it. But I think the book that I probably worked the hardest on is shown on the next slide, and that's 300 by Frank Miller and Lynn Varley. And every page of this book, it appeared as a 5-issue comic first, and every 2 facing pages formed a double page spread, a single image spread over 2 pages. And then it was collected in an oblong format where every 2 pages of the 2 facing pages of the comic became one single page of the book, which you see here. That's the cover of the book. Now, Frank, the next slide, you'll see an original black and white page by Frank. And Frank was working twice up. So these are two facing pages of a comic at twice up. His originals were gigantic. I mean, huge, because twice up and 2 pages in one. So I mean, he would send them to me in these big, giant portfolios wrapped 1,000 times. It was the only, I mean, there aren't boxes big enough to hold the art. It was so gigantic. And I would get these black and white pages, a page like this, where almost everything is black. And, you know, it was a color book, and Frank's then wife, Lynn Varley, was doing the color, and to hand painting the color, not a digital process. So you'd wonder, what can Lynn do with a black page? And then, oh my God, here comes the color. And it's what she has done is magnificent. And I've told this story a number of times, but it's always worth telling again. The first issue of 300, I had, of course, seen all the black and white pages, and then we printed those down to reproduction size on watercolor paper and sent those to Lynn to color. And she had about anywhere from 5 to 10 iterations of each page, so that if she wasn't happy with what she had, with the approach to one, she could put it aside and begin afresh. So she had several different opportunities to do each page the way she wanted to. And the day that she sent in the first issue of the color work, I was so overwhelmed at the beauty of what she had done that I literally wept. And that, I mean, if you're stirred like that, emotionally stirred like that when you're working on a project, then you know it's good. Anyway, I think Lynn is a marvelous artist. She's not given nearly enough credit in the comics industry. She's ignored because she was married to such a superstar, and all the attention was focused on him. But she is an incredible talent in her own right. She changed the face of color in comics in the middle 80s with Dark Knight Returns. She imported a French coloring process over to the US, the blue line color process, and painted by hand, gave artistry, I guess, to something that had just been considered a mechanical form beforehand. You'll see that the next slide is the very last page of the book of 300, and they're going off sort of to their death, but they're going to change the tide of the Greco-Persian War. And the subsequent slide is the way it was colored for the book. You see them, it's a dawn setting, a bright setting to give this sense of hope. The next slide, in fact, is the way Lynn originally colored it, where she set it at dusk. And you can see her palette, and you can see that she colored almost everything except for the three little heads on the right, before the three little helmets on the right, before she decided, nope, nope, I'm going to completely redo it. So that's the level of work that she was putting in to the book. And then, of course, we were still in those days working with drum scanners, and they had just begun to develop digital scanning. And as an editor, one of my main jobs was to proof the scans. And I was so determined to get to make sure that Lynn's colors would appear, it would reflect her work properly, would look like the originals, that I remember going up to 17 rounds of scans and corrections on one page, I mean, for every single page, there were multiple rounds of scans and corrections until I was satisfied. But yes, I drove the scanner crazy because there was at least one page where I went 17 rounds of corrections before I said okay. So
If I can ask, so that implies a very good and strong connection with the author, because you as the editor have to interpret and make sure that it is the way it was intended, right?
Yeah, yes, although it's, I mean, at this point, it's just a visual skill, really, you know, to have the art right next to you and then the scan and to compare the two and to try to make sure that the scanner is capturing, you know, scanners see all sorts of things that aren't really in the art. And so there's lots of cleanup work that you have to do, and some colors are difficult for a scanner to see, but you can go in and manually adjust that. I can't, but people can. And so I would just sit over their shoulder and until I was happy. And because the work was so beautiful, I wanted to be able to do it justice. So I think, I can't remember. Oh, the next slide will be Tim Sale, and a fun moment for us because we worked together on a Grendel. I'm really not much of a writer. Sorry, Tom, but I have written a few things in my life, and one was a Grendel story. And Tim and I, Tim always draws what I write. I don't know why that is, but right from the start, he's sort of been my go-to artist. He's a dear friend, and when DC Comics published a book called Solo, where each issue focused on a specific artist, and that artist would ask people to write him stories. So the first issue of Solo focused on Tim Sale, and Tim asked a handful of his friends to write him stories, and he came to me and he asked me for a romance story. And because he knows I'm a huge fan of the old Simon and Kirby romance comics. So I did, but because it was DC Comics and because I was going to have to sign a work for hire contract, that is a contract saying that I didn't own a damn thing of my story, I said, okay, I'll write a romance, but I want to play with a DC toy, my favorite DC toy. And so I wrote a Supergirl romance story, which you'll see on the next slide, called Young Love, which was a legitimate title that DC had published through the years. Young Love, pioneered, I should say, by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby back in the late 40s. So that was a fun. You see Supergirl here in her secret identity as Linda Lee Danvers, and I know all this stuff because I read those comics in the 60s voraciously. So
Thank you. This is awesome.
My next question for you, Diana, is can you walk us through, I know this is a loaded question, a typical day in the life of a comic book editor?
Yeah. Well, I think at this point we need to address process. Look, a comics editor, it has sort of two main jobs. One is production management. You have to make sure the trains keep moving. The other is quality control, the kind of thing that I did over those scans of Lynn's color. You want to make sure that the work is as good as it possibly can be. But you have to do that at every stage of the process. And part of this sort of dichotomy, if we want it good, but we want it Tuesday, involves another one too. I like to say that an editor works between a rock and a hard place, because the editor is like the fulcrum point between the publishing company, who after all pays her check, and the creator, whose work she represents to the publishing company. So she has to fight for the creator while at the same time representing, well, she represents the publisher to the creator and the creator to the publisher. And that really is between a rock and a hard place. So the next slide you'll see is what a comic script looks like. And in this case, it's my script for Tim, page 1 of that Supergirl story. And I did not edit my own story here, but I happen to have these slides so that I can show you how things operate. So we always begin with story, and story means script. And so the first thing that an editor does is work with the writer to make sure the script comes in on time and that it is as good as it possibly can be. The next stage of the process is the pencil art. The script then goes to the penciler, who translates the story into a sequence of static images, a number of panels per page, more or less following the script. If you took the time to read the script, you would see that I had called for the second panel to be very large, and that's not the way Tim drew it. But when you're collaborating, you have to go, it's a give and take sort of thing. So, and I was otherwise very happy with this page. The next stage is the inking stage. Tim Sale did pencils and inks, so his pencils were not as complete as they might otherwise be if you had two people handling penciling and inking. Since he was going to do the inking himself, he didn't have to pencil in every single detail. He knew what he was going to do with it. The next stage is lettering, which of course is now all done digitally, and then color, and then all those different digital files are somehow magically, mysteriously married together, and you have your final file. So for every single one of those stages, the editor must oversee deadlines and quality. And you're doing that for multiple issues of multiple comics every day. So it's a huge juggling act. And there, you guys wanted to know about the importance of deadlines. And so I found an old schedule, this one for the Monara Library. And if that's not blinding, all those dates, I don't know what is. but you live and die by your schedules. Books are returnable if you don't deliver them on time. In a periodical business such as comics, you must get the books out when you say you're going to, or they can be returned, and then you have to go through a new process of getting orders. And often, if you have to go solicit orders a second time, the orders go down. So, and a publishing company is worrying about money and when they're going to get a return on their investment, and they plot out those budgets, and they're banking on getting the return when they want to get the return. And so these are all the factors, I guess, that an editor has to keep in mind when she's working on a book.
I have a question. Sorry, I move maybe too fast onto the next slide. But in the process that you were describing, Diana, where you work with script and then all the additional artists that come to play a role, who is deciding who is going to illustrate a particular story? Now, this is different because you were asked by team to write a script, but in general, if you want to become a writer, do you bring a script and then do you suggest who is going to illustrate, or do you have to have both done?
It works both ways. Editors often will hire a creative team. They're assigned a project by a publisher, say. Dark Horse, for instance, had the license to publish Star Wars comics for 20 some years. So the Star Wars editor knows what books he has to publish, and he will go out and hire a writer and hire artists for those books. But then someone like Shannon Wheeler, say, will come to Dark Horse with his book, Too Much Coffee Man, that he had originally self-published, and sort of pitch it to Dark Horse as Dark Horse taking over publication. But Shannon owns Too Much Coffee Man, so he comes attached to that project. That's not for an editor to go hire someone else. When Shannon is bringing his project to Dark Horse, he is bringing himself to Dark Horse. So it works both ways.
Can I point out we have some interesting feedback in the Zoom group chat? If you hit on the bottom on the chat button, people are asking questions.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm having a hard time because if I do share the full screen,
Okay.
I don't have all the windows. Hold on, if I can see chat. Okay. Yep. So do you want to go over now to this maybe? Or
it's up to you guys.
I have one from Denise that is asking, so I'm gonna cover maybe some. To what degree are comics today hand-drawn and colored versus computer generated? Is one method valued over another?
Yeah, well, it's been now almost 6 years since I have worked on staff at Dark Horse, but I believe that most comics are still hand-drawn. That said, I think many artists do their own scanning now, though I used to discourage that at Dark Horse because we had a couple of scan gurus who really knew what they were doing, and too often when I would receive scans from an artist instead of the original pages, those scans were a big mess, and they were done on a shoddy, cheap scanner, whereas we had state-of-the-art equipment at the office. and so it would represent more work for me to have to arrange to get those scans cleaned up than if we had just done the scanning in the first place. As for working directly digitally, well, certainly lettering and coloring are done that way, but I don't. Yeah, more and more people are working that way, but I still think most people are drawing on the board. That said, I worked. This is quite a few years ago now. In the early 2000s, I was working with Harlan Ellison on a book called Harlan Ellison's Dream Corridor. And we were collecting some already published stories and some not published stories into a trade paperback. And I contacted Brian Boland, a fantastic artist who's worked mostly for DC. He drew The Killing Joke, written by Alan Moore, among other things. And I asked him to draw the cover to this Harlan Ellison collection of stories. And I said, look, we're selling Harlan here, so can you draw Harlan on the cover? And Brian sent back a beautiful, and unfortunately I don't have it with these slides, he sent back a beautiful, detailed drawing of Harlan. And it was so gorgeous that Harlan called me immediately and said, I have to own that. I have to buy that I have to buy the original art from Brian. But Brian is in England, and he sent everything, over the airwaves, he sent everything digitally. So I called Brian and said, Harlan would like to buy the original of this, to which Brian responded, oh, I'm so sorry, Diana, it only exists in the computer. It was not an actual, not drawn on a board. So yeah, I mean, even some of our greatest artists are working entirely digitally. I think mostly for online comics, people work directly on the computer. No, I don't know, because I don't really like reading comics on screen. Sorry. I'm old and I'm old fashioned that way. I really like books, printed objects.
Yeah, and there are comments of people loving the art that you are showing. So that question was from Denise Walsh. Then Jana Nogowski, that is remarking how the storyboarding for the film, the resemblance between the one for the comics and a script for a film. And she mentioned that the way the script was, and then the way the penciling and the inking, so the process is that of a building. Ellie Schwab is agreeing with that, because he says when he creates comics, he literally writes a movie script, and then the thumbnail, storyboards, and then draws the pages.
But there's a huge difference between movies and comics, between film and comics, of course, and that is movies move and comics do not. And I've worked with screenwriters before who don't seem to understand that a panel is a static image and you cannot show 10 actions in one panel. It doesn't work that way. It works with a camera when people are moving in front of the camera, but it's certainly, there is nothing on that page that's moving. Everyone is frozen. And when you're writing a comic, you have to keep in mind, and this is the important point or one of the important points made by Scott McCloud in Understanding Comics, is that the creator, the artist, is conceiving a series of these static images that are intended for the reader to take and make the connections between them. So the images have to be, you know, they have to work in such a way that the reader will be able to understand how they are connected and to be able to connect them. And this Scott McCloud calls closure. Not the English lit kind of closure that we're used to. And with film, well, it's simply you have sound and you have motion, which you do not have in comics. So they are two fundamentally different mediums, though they certainly have similarities.
Keep going through here. Let me see. Kenneth is asking, as an editor, how do you navigate the political landscape in deciding what work gets published?
I'm not sure what that means, political landscape.
Maybe internal politics?
Yeah, well, look, most companies, and Dark Horse certainly is one, has a process of decision making about new projects. An editor is pitched something or another and decides to fight for it or not, decides it's worth publishing or not worth publishing. If she thinks it is, then she goes to the company, to the powers that be, the bean counters, the marketers, the boss, and makes a case for the work, presents a budget, a timetable, tells them about the project, and discusses potential sales, and then it's a group decision. So if that person wants to explain via chat what they mean by political, I'd be curious.
Yeah, so then I don't know if people are free, I believe, to unmute themselves. Do we want to open the question now, given that the time is into the lecture? We kind of got to the 1 hour mark. Tom, Diane?
Sure.
It's up to Diana. I mean,
Yeah.
We are on COVID time. You know?
Yeah, we don't have anywhere to go anyhow. But there is a, oh, sorry.
I'm fine. Whatever you guys want to do. All cool.
So as we were saying, Kenneth can maybe further elaborate on the question that he asked, and if the answer was satisfactory, I mean, if satisfied his curiosity. But we have Kristen Cho that is asking, how long does it take for a book to go from script to final products? How much time does a writer or an artist get to do their work for a particular issue?
Well,
General.
I used to say that comics are like babies and they need 9 months. But when you publish periodical comics are published on a monthly basis. That means everyone needs to be able to do their job within a month. Certainly the artist needs to be able to pencil 22 or 24 pages, whatever it is, in a month's time. Now, that's a model that goes back to, it's a traditional model of ongoing monthly comics, Spider-Man number 678. I mean, that just keeps coming out every single month. When you're working with limited series, then it's a bit of a different ballgame. You can sort of work until most of the issues are done and then begin to release. Frank Miller certainly didn't draw every issue of 300 in a month's time, but we built up issues, and I think we had 3 issues before we solicited orders for the first one, and we set a release date that we thought we could meet afterwards. And that's knowing your artists and knowing when they're going to come through, what the delays might be. For instance, with Frank, every time we set a number for a limited series, 5 issues for 300, I forget, 7 or 8 for Sin City, Hell and Back. In any case, by the time he would get to the last issue, I always knew it was going to have to be a double issue. He always had more story left to tell than he thought, and it just happened pretty regularly. So I began to plan for that, plan for that extra time. But you work with your artists to set up the date. Of course, you're also, again, the publisher wants a return on the project as soon as possible because they're outlaying money in advance while the work is being done, and they want the return, which they don't get until that book is in stores and selling. So it's it's a juggling process. If you allot 9 months from plot to book in print in stores, that's enough time for people to get sick, to blow deadlines. You can still recoup. Most companies do not give it that much time. And in order to get that much time, I used to have to fight with the publisher at every instance. But if you give me 9 months, I can pretty much guarantee that I will get the issues out. DC, for instance, I think works on a 6-month timetable, sometimes even less. I've had my first Will Eisner graphic novel. I was given 4 months to get it out. 4 months, an entire book, but we did it. Didn't do much else in those 4 months, though.
I'm sure you must have got up and go to bed with that. So I have a comment by Jana Nogowski. Some of my friends who are illustrators sketch first and finalize digitally. It's weird to adjust to knowing that it's going to be digital. It's like a Polaroid picture, and yes, it's got to be difficult, but comics portray that action so well. So it's clearly an art to illustrate.
Yeah.
Denise Walsh is also asking another question. Is there a particular place where comic artists sell their original work as art? Roy Lichtenstein clearly showed this as a market. So I assume artists make money this way. Is that correct?
Yeah, Lichtenstein stole art from Tony Abruzzo, a DC artist, and some others. Sam Glanzman, I believe. He basically just looked at the comics and then stole what he saw and drew it big, painted it big, and then went out and made millions of dollars while the comics artists whose work he reproduced were struggling to make a living. So I am not really a big fan of that, but yes, comics artists do sell their art. You'll see there's on the wall behind me, there's a Kurt Schaffenberger 1962 cover of Lois Lane, the original artwork. Most artists sell their work at conventions, or if they're big enough, they have specific dealers who sell the art for them.
That's good. We have actually a clarification from Kenneth. He meant national or international politics when he was asking the question earlier, and specifically is referring to who is deciding what work is too offensive for publication, for instance, given international.
These days, everything's offensive, I think. Or should I say, everyone is worried that something might be interpreted as possibly offensive by some. In fact, that was a recent line from a publisher I will not name, telling me that they were not going to publish a certain book because it might risk being interpreted as offensive by some. Get a pair. Anyway, yeah, I don't know what to say about that. I think if the work is beautiful and it tells a good story, well, look, editors perform a kind of gateway function. They make decisions about which stories to publish all the time. If you have a group of editors, you're going to have some who lean one way and you're going to have some who lean another way. So hopefully you get an overall wide representation of stuff. I think that book burning is really dangerous. So I don't know. And I don't really like politics to interfere with my decisions. I suppose, for me, it's about the quality of the work.
Yeah. We still had a few questions on our list. I don't know if it's late, but we are free, I guess, in our discussion to see where we lead. But what we were, one question that I felt strongly was, is there a diplomatic way to reject a writer or artist whose work you don't like, or you had, for any reason, any?
Yeah, look, yeah, I think honesty is always the best policy. When you're working with your creators, they need to be able to trust you. They need to be able to trust what you say. They need to be able to trust your opinion. They may not always agree with you, and that's okay. I once argued with my brother-in-law, Matt Wagner, over a Grendel script that he had written. We argued for 20 minutes on the phone because I maintained that he had used a word that was going to be completely misinterpreted. It did not mean what he thought it meant. And we argued and argued and argued. And finally he said to me, "Di, it's my book." End of argument. It's his book. It's his copyright. He's the creator owner, and I have spent my career promoting that and believing in that. And so we let it run the way he wanted to. But that doesn't mean I didn't try to fight for what I thought needed to be done.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it's important to be honest with the freelancers at all times. That doesn't mean you have to be nasty or hurt someone's feelings. You need to keep in mind how they feel. They've just offered you their most precious baby and you're turning it down. So, you understand that, you apologize, but if it doesn't float your boat, you're not going to put in the effort that it needs anyways. So it's much better to love the work that you're working on, I think. It just stands to reason you're going to give it more of yourself.
Yeah. Thanks. No, that's thank you. Tom, Diane?
There's one more question I see here from Michael. It says, I think he's trying to ask us, what type of artwork do you think should be in somebody's portfolio, a student portfolio, for a job interview today for the comic book industry? I think that's what he's trying to say.
Well, definitely, a lot of beginners make this mistake. They they do single illustrations. Comics are not single illustrations. Comics are storytelling, panel to panel storytelling. So that's the first thing. An editor needs to see how well you can tell a story. That is, draw sequences of panels to convey action and meaning. Another mistake that I often see by beginners is that they'll present you with sample pages, storytelling pages, but it's just one fight scene after another. Big muscled heroes punching each other. Not all comics are superheroes, and even the superhero comics only have a small number of fight pages per issue. The rest of the time, there's the city, buildings, cars, normal human people, interiors of houses, regular, normal stuff. And you have to be able to show that you can draw that too, not just big superheroes punching each other.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's really a great response.
Yeah.
It's very true.
Yeah, I mean, even, people, again, like my brother-in-law, Matt Wagner, who had already been published, spent one summer doing nothing but walking around Philadelphia with a sketchbook and, sitting down and just drawing what he saw to better his skills. So very important.
I really love that you're also specifically talking about drawing, pencil. It's so hard to get that across today to many of the students. It's really about, starting with that idea, pencil to paper, and then take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really important.
Although, it's, I have to say, the way the industry has gone, it used to be that the famous Marvel bullpen was a center area surrounded by the editor's offices. And in that center area were artists actually working on art boards, production artists, designing logos and fixing art or cleaning art, fixing lettering mistakes, that kind of thing. Now all of that is done digitally. And I remember the last time when I was still at Dark Horse asking for a logo sketch, a few sketches, not a chance. No, they're
Tough.
all, they're all on a computer, and I'm going to see some font or another, and that's how it goes. Yeah.
Tough to
Sad.
Uh,
But But if you're drawing comics, you really, yeah, pencil to paper, you must. And another mistake too is because of this tendency in comics publishing to work along that assembly line process, the penciler is not always the same as the inker. And so if you're submitting your work to an editor, say at a convention for them to look at, you should just pencil, don't ink your work. Your pencils might be very good and your inks might not. So you're damaging your own ability to get work.
On that note, I got a quick question. I guess it's another loaded one, but what's more important, a well-written story or a nicely illustrated one? I mean, I know that's a tricky question, but.
Well, the answer is yes.
Good.
Yeah.
I mean, it's comics. So it really has to be both. And I would actually go further, Tom, and say that comics is primarily visual. So you can have the best written story in the world, but if the page looks like crap, people are not going to, they're not going to pick up the comic. They're not going to read the story. But that said, the way words and pictures work in comics, there's a kind of gestalt, you know, it's not just the words, the stories here and the art is there. They really come together to create something that's greater than just one or the other. So if they're not working together properly, then, you know, abandon hope, all ye who enter. I mean, that's so as to your question, that's why I say yes, they both have to be working at top capacity and together to create something that's greater than the whole.
Thank you.
It's awesome.
So, and continuing that, I have a question, like, how often do you find that these two abilities are in the same person? There's great at writing the story and also illustrating the story. And how often do you see a team meaning like maybe two people, two individuals that complement each other? And as an editor, is for you easier to deal with specific tasks carried out and specific, you know, individual, or with just one?
I would say that, well, first of all, traditionally, comics were made by the full cartoonist, a writer artist. And it was only when comic book publishers in the 40s came along and needed to publish comics every month because they were, again, periodical publishers, that this artificial split happened between the writer and the artist. So, and this is something that has been carried to the present day, where the jobs are parceled out along this assembly line. But in fact, in fact, the real artistry of comics is the writer artist, the individual person writer artist. And for me, I would almost always, you know, there's a kind of singularity of vision there that I think is really important. So, so for me, yeah, I would rather work with someone like Shannon Wheeler, who writes and draws his own work.
Slung over your arm.
But that's not to say that I haven't had some great, I mean, I can't draw. So when Tim Sale and I work together. You know, there's a great collaborative thing that happens, that can happen in comics too. So
it's like another translation when you have to have an individual carry out only one part, then
right,
the translation into
yeah,
convey that. Okay.
yeah, yeah.
I see a
Yeah.
question here. I'm sorry. You see a question here from Eli. Was there ever a project you wanted to work on that you didn't? And was there even a project you vetoed you wish you didn't? Matt's Grendel novel? Question mark.
Eli's referring to a novel that my brother-in-law wrote about his character Grendel. He was commissioned by one of the New York publishers. This was in 89, I believe, 88 or 89. Commissioned by one of the New York prose publishers, I forget who, maybe Random House, I forget who, to write a novel based on his comic book character. And Matt is the perfect example of what I was just talking about. He is a consummate writer artist. He has written for other artists, but his work is best when he's doing both, himself. So Matt sat down, you know, he took the advance the publisher offered him, and he sat down and he wrote a Grendel novel. And then he gave it to me, and it was not good. It was not good. And I had to, and he was my brother-in-law at that point, and also, you know, had been my friend for 5 years at that point, and I had to tell him it was not good. But it wasn't, and he realized it, and he shelved it. So no, I'm not sorry I didn't veto that. It wasn't really mine to veto. He had just asked me to read it. And I did as a favor. I didn't take money for it or anything. So of course I gave him my honest opinion. But I told him he was not a writer of prose. He was a comics writer, and it's a very different thing. So, you know, a prose writer is working with words. A comics writer is working with images at all times. Two different mediums. So no, I'm not sorry I told Matt not to publish that book and make a fool of himself. And I forget what Eli's other question was.
Was there ever a project you wanted to work on that you didn't?
Oh, I really wanted to do a romance. I really wanted to do like an anthology of romance comics, and I never did do that. I was pitched at one point a reprint project of the Simon and Kirby romance. Joe Simon and Jack Kirby created the romance comics genre in 1947 with the first issue of Young Romance. And this fellow in Seattle had just, you know, in the 2000s had just discovered that. He didn't know that. And the books, I guess, many of the books were in public domain, so they were up for grabs to be published. And he pitched Dark Horse on doing a collection of Simon and Kirby romance comics. And I was all for it. I thought that would be fantastic. But then we contacted Joe Simon. Jack had already died in the 90s, but Joe was still alive. And Joe had another deal going with Titan Comics in England, and they were publishing a lot of the old Simon and Kirby stuff. And Joe said, you know, well, I already have a deal with them to publish the romance comics, so even though they're in public domain, I hope that you won't publish them. So so we decided, again, because my whole lifetime has been about the rights of creators and not exploiting them, we decided to do as Joe had asked us and not to publish. So then and of course the person who pitched the project just went to another publisher and they published them. So I'm sorry I wasn't involved with that project. I would have liked to do that. But I feel better that I did what Joe Simon asked. So.
Now there are many authors that do self-publish, or at least that there is so much more work out there. For someone like in your position as an editor, you have an ability to shop around, maybe a little easier for emerging artists. And do you solicit people that?
Oh, sure. Sure. And that's, I mean, one way to meet new artists, people who are trying to break into the industry, one very good way, I should say, is going to conventions. There are always, at the comic book conventions, I mean, obviously we can't do this now, but at the comic book conventions, there are always editors who set aside specific hours each day to do nothing but look at people's portfolios, specifically art. It's impossible to read some, you know, when you're at the San Diego convention and there are 135,000 people around you, you can't focus enough on a writing submission. You know, that's the kind of thing you have to take home and read. But yeah, San Diego, 1999, two young Brazilian men came up to me and they were twins and they brought me their work. And it just, you know, they were nice kids, but it wasn't, the work wasn't right. They flew back from Sao Paulo the next year and presented me their work. And the next year, and then finally one year, it was right. And I said, okay, let's go. And those twins were Fabio Muna and Gabriel Ba. Gabrielle is co-creator of the Umbrella Academy. They did a book called Day Tripper for DC. They went on to be, you know, people to watch in Entertainment Weekly. I mean, their career has exploded, but I found them first. And yeah, that's certainly, that's a big part of the job, is encouraging new talent, spotting new talent, and publishing new talent. And you know, one way to do that, I mean, I first published Fabio and Gabrielle in an anthology book called Autobiographics, and it was all personal, true autobio stories by a collection of artists, including people like Will Eisner and Frank Miller and Sergio Aragonés, and you know, people with big reputations in the industry. Matt, did I say Matt Wagner? And my Brazilian twins, whom nobody knew at the time, but there they were in the same book with all those other sort of stellar creators. And so this is one way to get a new creator known. It's difficult to just publish a new creator right off the bat. People are, you know, people only have so much money to spend. They don't know your work. They may not want to take a chance. But if you put them in a book with a bunch of other people who can sell the book, then that's a way of introducing them. So, yeah.
Okay.
We are on now, I guess, at the end. I'm reading one question submitted by Michael D. asking, can you maybe give us an idea? Somebody that just started in the field of becoming an editor, what type of salary can he?
Oh. Yeah, I
I don't know.
actually, I don't really know that. I don't know the answer to that. Is that Michael Dooley asking that question? I don't really know that. Most people start at the assistant level, which is an entry level position. So they're not making very much money, but they're learning on the job. And you know, as they go up the ladder, they make more money. Are you going to be rich as a comic book editor? No. No. Yeah, no, not at all. That said, if you go to work for DC Comics, one of the big corporate giants, for instance, and you rise up the admin level, say to editor-in-chief like Murray Javins at DC Comics now, the money's certainly going to be much, much better. You know, that's Warner Brothers money. So
That wasn't me, by the way. There's another Michael D.
oh.
I don't know if he has a follow-up to that or anything. But
No.
It was me.
It's one
Yeah.
of my students.
Yeah.
I don't know what money they pay assistants. It's not very much, but again, it's your way in. It's your way into making some living at some point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that this was just awesome, and I felt that everyone that's still here was really enjoying, and I didn't want to break the moment, but I think we are now half an hour into the overtime, right? So I really appreciate your answer, the participation of all those that are still here, and I don't know if anyone wants to add anything at this point, but I find
It's been wonderful. I can't thank you enough. It's just been wonderful to meet you and greet you and to chat with you, to learn so much about you and to listen to you today. So thank you. Kudos to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. And I want to say to you guys and to your students that this is a hell of a book. You call it a magazine, but it's got a perfect binding. That's a book to me, and it's professionally produced. It's beautiful. I would never imagine this to come. I don't know where you get your money to do this, but I would never imagine something of this level of quality to come out of a university, let alone a community college. So kudos to you guys, man, because this is really very, very beautiful. You've done a fantastic job with this. So
thank you, Diane. I mean, coming from you, we kind of blush here. But yeah, we really we have awesome students, and that's why we're trying to engage them and myself, with this lecture to kind of understand we are there learning new things, but where are they taking us? So where can I apply what I learn? How can I get to where I see somebody? So having you here today and sharing your experience and see how many paths really are merging, you going from poetry to, right, to be an editor and comics and romance and languages. So really brings a lot of things together. Very nice.
It's because I'm old. So
no, there are people that can become older and have learned nothing. So.
Well, I've lived a lot of years, so I've had the opportunity to do a lot of things. And,
it's awesome. Thank you for sharing all of that with us.
Thank you.
Well,
thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Tom, for contacting me about this in the first place.
Thank you, Diana. This is very educational. And I mean, for anyone watching and participating now or later, this is great for editors, writers, artists. And, you know, I like that the undercurrent of is you have to start somewhere and you have to keep on practicing. And at times you have to be meticulous. You really have to work hard at it. And that's really important.
Yeah,
Thank
you really do have to work hard. There's, you know, people who slack, just they're just not going to get anywhere. You know, slacking doesn't pay off. It doesn't pay off financially. More importantly, it doesn't pay off personally, I don't think so.
Okay,
Thank you.
kudos.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.